and more efficient European policies.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Oettinger. I thought that was extremely forceful and will surely give us much to speak about. It is now a great pleasure to welcome Sigmar Gabriel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. And Minister Gabriel, Germany is, of course, it was already mentioned, a net payer. So just for that reason, I think people will be very interested to hear what you have to say. But of course, you're also part of your party is part of the ongoing coalition agreement going on in Germany, and Europe and the EU is a big part of that debate. So we're all ears, and may I ask you now to come up and take the floor. Thank you.
First of all, I have to say that we are net winners, not net payers. But normally it could be very easy. I could say I'm on the same opinion like Günther Oettinger and Jean-Claude Juncker. We can have a coffee break. But unfortunately, you invited me to make a speech, and so now I will speak. But in German. Meine sehr geehrten Damen.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Jean-Claude Juncker, Günther Oettinger, colleagues. Indeed. I haven't prepared a speech to argue against anything Jean-Claude Juncker and Günther Oettinger have said. You'll see very quickly. But I agree with pretty well everything. And perhaps it's a fine thing if, to begin with, at the start of my speech, I should not talk immediately about finances, but via Günther Oettinger, make my contribution as to how people in Germany, at least, could be convinced that your position is right. What kind of arguments can one deploy to find support? And when we're in Brussels, and a lot of what we hear in Brussels we take for granted, but sometimes there's a need to explain it a bit more back home. And there's a need to remember what actually we're negotiating about here. Much has changed over recent years, indeed dramatically over the last 12 months, and not all of it for the best. We have less security, less things we can now count on, and much has started to move in Europe, and many things people thought were certain have turned out to be fragile or even broken already. However, notwithstanding all these major challenges and problems, the European Union is regarded throughout the world as something of a unique place for democracy, freedom and stability. That's how the rest of the world sees us. You'll not find anywhere else in the world a comparable successful project bringing together states and peoples. And in the European Union, sometimes we have our own doubts about this, but there are many millions of people outside of the European Union who are convinced that this is the case, that Europe is actually what from the 18th to the 19th, 19th and 20th centuries, what the United States were, a place of freedom. Freedom not just from oppression and persecution, but freedom to form and shape your own life. A place where your own children will be able to lead a better life than their parents could in the country they originally came from. Europe, for many people now in the world, has become what the US was. Europe is the place people long to be so they can enjoy freedom. Now, obviously, that brings many problems with it for us in Europe when we have this mass immigration, people who are fleeing from war or civil war or just looking for a better life. It's difficult for us to cope with all of that, and sometimes it seems about to tear the EU apart. But notwithstanding all of that, after almost 70 years on from the end of the Second World War, it is still something which is marvellous. Europe at that time was a place where people ran away from, that people were scared of, especially because of Germany. Germany had been the cause of that fear. And from being a fearful place, Europe has become a place people long to be. And I think that actually is at the heart of this amazing story of European integration. It started with courageous men and women who, a few years after the devastation of the Second World War, wanted to get Germany back to the table of civilized peoples in Europe. They must have been pretty courageous, those men and women. Luxembourgers, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Italians, the French, and others. I'm sure they weren't as wildly enthusiastic to invite people from Germany and to ask us how we saw the shape of Europe. We who'd been responsible for genocide and devastation of our countries. I think that called for great courage on the part of those people, those statesmen, to invite Germany back to the discussion table. But those who founded the European Union knew that literally it was a question of life and death. The return of nationalism, as François Mitterrand always said, is something which would imply war again. At the start of the European Union, it was literally a question of life and death. And why am I saying that? Heaven knows what a fortunate community we are now. But it's just a question of arguing about money, but not life and death. I'm not saying that ironically. If you look back at our history of success in the European Union, you've got to think back to where we came from in the beginning. And at least we're now talking about problems that we can get an overview of. We're talking about mid-term funding, for example. Jean-Claude Juncker, I agree on that, certainly. So I'm saying this deliberate to begin with. We need courage again, not less courage than in the past. We need courage still. Sometimes it's easier to talk about technocratic and bureaucratic things and to be rude about them more even than what we ought to say about our own national setups. And it's easy to report back home that you're protecting your country's own money. But when it comes to the financial administrative problems, we mustn't forget that we have had this huge story of success, that we've turned Europe from a place people are afraid of to a place people yearn to be. Let's consider the success story again. Let's make it clear to our peoples again what a success story we are. And if we manage to do that, then perhaps when they hear of our internal discussions about financing and architecture, they might understand us better and give us more support. Ladies and gentlemen, in a time of a radically changing world, many people in this world have an elementary interest in a stable, strong Europe, first and foremost ourselves. We are perhaps amongst the few that are capable of defending our interests and values, values which in the past we talked about Western values. I'm not saying that as a geographic concept, but more a universal concept, universal values, which seeks to protect freedom and democracy for citizens, based on a community of solidarity where we take responsibility and support each other. The European Union of today needs to be able to continue to deliver on that because of financial, economic and political crises we've suffered in recent years. In the coming years, we need to overcome our internal divisions and refound Europe as a strong international player. It's not as easy as that for us, because in Europe we founded ourselves internally to provide our internal peace, our internal prosperity. The European Union wasn't founded as a global player. Certainly in Germany, we left that to the Brits, French and Americans. When something went wrong, we had somebody we could argue about it. But that's not going to work like that in the future. We have to defend by ourselves European interests and defend them as Europe. That's a task which is just for Europe. And it is a task that we have to take up, actually opening a new chapter in European politics and history. And certainly we in Germany have good reasons for doing that, and for taking on that challenge with courage and responsibility. We need a European policy which is ambitious, founded on solidarity. We shouldn't work on the basis of red lines that one's not meant to cross. We need to look further. We need more Europe, therefore, but often a different kind of Europe. Let's have no illusions about this. Europe is not an aim in its own right. Europe rather is there to make sure that we have something that makes us strong in terms of foreign policy and defence, and how we deal with issues such as migration. In order to convince Europeans, we need to deliver on this. Europe's ability to act together in this respect are closely bound together. To begin with, ladies and gentlemen, and that in fact Jean-Claude Juncker and Günther Oettinger have said this already. To begin with, we need to deploy the correct narrative. The first wrong narrative is that of the net contributors, where on an arithmetical basis you calculate how much revenue goes from a tax of that country to Europe, and then how much expenditure in terms of support comes back to the country. In my country, this is one of the favourite wrong narratives about Europe. Politicians have told that narrative from all parties, and over the last 30 or 40 years, unfortunately, having heard that, many people believe that tale. As if the financing of the EU is just a zero-sum game, where on a gracious basis you help others without actually benefiting yourself. But I think everybody in this room knows that this is false, this narrative. The truth is we're not a net contributor. We're actually the biggest net beneficiary of European integration, literally, economically and financially, certainly politically. We export our goods not mainly to China or the United States, but 60% of our goods are exported to Germany, 44% the EU. Now, it's only if the countries around us are doing well enough to afford our goods that Germans can then work and make a living. Nobody's dependent so much on the prosperity of other member states as Germany is. And for that reason, I say we are not net contributors. We, in economic, financial and political, net beneficiaries of being members of the European Union. Secondly, there's always talk of loss of sovereignty of the EU. The truth is we, in the 21st century, as nation states, in an age where Asia, Africa and Latin America are growing, and we in absolute terms are shrinking, then people are familiar with the theory of having more kids in Germany. In practice, it does not. I'm not guilty myself. I've got 3 daughters. Well, my wife would say, at least I've done my job. But the point is, we are losing in importance in terms of numbers of population and size of economy compared to other parts of the world. In the world of the 21st century, Europe will only be able to act on a sovereign basis via the European Union, by winning back sovereignty through the European Union, which we have actually lost in today's and tomorrow's world. Even Germany, big and strong as it is, in tomorrow's world will not have a voice to be heard by itself. Our children and grandchildren will have the choice of having no voice to be heard or a common European voice. There's no loss of sovereignty by being part of the European Union. There might be a loss of sovereignty when it comes to shaping life in Europe if we did not have a European Union, and if nation states by themselves would have to defend the interests of their population. And I think it's important to make sure that our society understands better this modern concept of what real sovereignty is. And a third false narrative that's easier to dispel is that of multi-speed Europe. Now, it is partly true with things like Schengen and the monetary union. Yes, there is, on that basis, certainly Europe at different speeds. But to be honest, I would be happy if that were our only problem. When it comes to differing speeds, everybody's more or less moving in the same direction. Some are moving quicker than others. But actually, our problem is not so much the speeds, but it's multi-track. In the meantime, what we're seeing is rather differing understandings as to what the EU is developing into. And if we're not successful in setting common objectives for the European Union and making sure that they are effective, it will become more and more difficult for us in our member states to generate acceptance of what we're doing and asking for more money to do it. Europe, when it comes to the division of powers, rule of law, fighting corruption, freedom of press, etc., is not in full agreement with itself, will not enjoy long-term sustainable support from its citizens, which is why every budget, however big or small it is at the end of a time, is based on principle of solidarity, where together you fund shared responsibility and objectives, amongst which are maintaining freedom, democracy and the rule of law on our continent. The last myth I'd like to address is this thing you hear again and again, a fear of a debt union and euro bonds transferring funds from one country to another. This is something which many people in the north of Europe fear that as taxpayers they're going to end up funding those in the south of Europe and then refuse to grant solidarity. This is again is a myth, and I think we have to get out of that. We have actually in practice some form of common indebtedness in Europe. Who at the end of the day is responsible for the financial risks borne by the European Central Bank over recent years? It's actually the member states of the EU, the ECB, the European Central Bank, because of the refusal of politics to assume its own responsibility. The ECB has found itself in the role of funding European development. It wasn't a role they sought themselves, became into being because politics was not ready to assume its own responsibility vis-à-vis its own citizens. It fell to the ECB to do that, and the ECB was courageous enough to do that. So, if you like, on a sort of hidden basis, we already have a transfer union, hidden euro bonds, etc., without clear political objectives or without the political Europe giving shape to it. And I think that too has to have an end put to it. Our economic and monetary union has to be made more future-proof. We need to avoid these current debates about bank crisis, the role of the ECB, and the point that we still have too high rates of unemployment in some parts of Europe. We need to overcome that to increase confidence and trust of our citizens in the European project. I prefer to make some more basic comments because my fear and concern is that we try and solve our midterm financing as a technical job where we get into some argument about net contributors, net beneficiaries, and have to agree on something somewhere in the middle. But it's not enough, actually. We need to be clear what we're actually talking about, what tasks are before us, and how we wish to tackle them together. It's only on that basis that we can find the support to provide the necessary funding available. Jean-Claude Juncker and Günther Oettinger, I think, have outlined these tasks very well, and what is the challenge is. I think we can build on positive experience. What Europe has achieved on the basis of roughly 160 billion euros a year is very much a success story. If you see how many European countries have come on economically, how much research we've done, a lot of things that have been achieved would have not been possible without the funds available via Brussels. Europe would have missed a number of opportunities. North, South, all Eastern member states have benefited hugely from European integration. We are all winners from European integration. We're all beneficiaries. So I'd like to take this opportunity to ask what task for the future do we wish to cover our budget? This is very much a political challenge. It's not an accountancy exercise. Do we have enough European funding to cover our future? Are we targeting on the right policy areas? Can we do everything that our citizens want us to do? Can we achieve European added value which is greater than the sum of our national contributions? And how can we combine what we do and fund with our shared values? And I think it's answering those questions only that we can give shape for the next financial framework, rather than arguing about how much each member state has to contribute. Then we have a question of traditional expenditure, cohesion, agriculture. It still cover a very high amount of our expenditure, almost 3/4, but we're spending comparatively much less on research development, also on foreign and security policy, where many of the tasks are still covered out of national budgets. So on the traditional expenditure areas which still command a great share of the budget, we need to reconsider that looking ahead to the future. Better spending is not just a question more spending. On the contrary, first of all, we have to have a debate about are we spending on the right things? The money we have at present, are we spending it on what we really need to be spending on? And then if that's not enough, then yes, we have to consider more spending. There's no opposition between better spending and more spending. You can still argue better spending and defend more spending. So when it comes to traditional policy areas, we need to shape them in such a way that they can also react to the new challenges of the future. In certain member states, this will mean that in future we'll no longer accept that there will be less. Now, Jean-Claude Juncker talked about the German-speaking area. Günther Oettinger and myself demonstrate that you have different kinds of German-speaking from North and the South, the German-speaking parts of Europe, but you hear from both sides that they want to maintain the status quo. However, that is detrimental to Europe as a whole. It's not a question of being net contributors or net benefits. It's a question of making advantage of added value. There are 5 key points which I'd like to highlight if we are to get European funding onto an improved new quality basis. As we look ahead to the important weeks of the formation of a new government in Germany, you have to accept that this is my political position. And as a politician, I do hope I will be able to have this upheld in Germany. But you must understand that. But obviously, the coalition formation continues in Germany. I can't say what the final position will be. But whoever the new German government be, it will be a coalition government in which Europe will be at the centre of a coalition agreement. It's not always been the case in Germany, but I'm sure whatever party is finally in the next German government, nobody is going to duck the issue on the importance of Europe. Firstly, we need to create growth and employment. That is the number one expectation, nationally, European level. Also, social justice and equity, which means more tax convergence and tax fairness. Also, a common labour market policy and a strong European investment programme. Now, a few years ago already, but I remember this quite well, there was a report from the European Commission in which there was a description saying that the European Union per year, because of legal forms of tax avoidance, every year was losing €1 billion. 1 billion. Now, for my country, 150 sorry, 1 trillion, 150 billion for Germany. 1 trillion overall. Now, ambitious finance policy won't perhaps get anywhere near that amount, but let's assume that the changes which can get us out of the unfortunate system of tax dumping. You don't have to look out for France of Panama and Bahamas. In the middle of the European Union, you have countries where 10 or 20% of the amount concerned is mobilized there, which in fact would cover already the budget which we are making available for EU. In my own country, I can't explain to any local baker that he normally has to pay a higher rate of tax than Amazon, Google or Starbucks. I can't explain that to anybody, why a hard-working man has to pay more tax relatively than a multinational. And I think this really is a key issue of fairness and equity. And I certainly understand small businessmen who are finding this as anti-competitive, this kind of tax dumping which they're too small to engage in, and it's something you can find even within the European single market. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to agree on a fairer taxation policy. I'm not saying that we have to have a single harmonized tax, but we need to get beyond this unfair difference of treatment between small business and the multinationals. Now, as part of the European semester, every year the Commission asks Member States to carry out structural reforms to improve their competitiveness. These are recommendations which I think need to be linked to cohesion funds which are made available from the EU budget. But the cohesion fund is meant to promote growth and employment. It can mean in some cases where structural reforms have not progressed far enough, but actually more money has to be spent, and the debate mustn't always be that if somebody's encountered a certain structural reform, they should get less money. Sometimes you have to do the opposite. In fact, I've never really understood why, for example, in Germany, there's always talk about the 3% criterion when it comes to deficit and such a big debate about it. What my country was the following. We carried out social reforms starting in 2003 at the same time as increasing our internal deficit. Now, we knew that structural reform was not going to work if we were reducing the deficit rapidly at the same time. We managed to get the structural reform through, but now we benefit from a surplus. So sometimes it can be necessary that on the way towards structural reform, you actually have to help a country more than in the past. And those whose reforms have not progressed enough should not be punished or threatened with withdrawal of funds. However, I think that we need to develop necessary flexibility for this. Secondly, the economic monetary union has to be completed. We need to have economic and social convergence. We need to complete the banking union, whether that be for Eurozone alone or EU27. We, in the MFF, have to have some funding earmarked to be better armed against future crises. And to that end, we should not forget a very important aspect of the euro. Should not create a situation where north, south, west, east, rich and poor move further apart. At the start of December, the Commission also made a proposal about there should be a budget which helps steer against this. And I think that is something which we should learn from the past. Crisis should not lead to huge rises in unemployment. And then a question on solidarity with third countries. We become a desired place for migrants from many other countries to live and find a better life. We were not prepared for that when mass immigration started. We've learned a bit, but we should have no illusions about this. We need to have surer borders around us, but also we need to work together with Africa to reduce the pressure of immigration. And we shouldn't leave Africa just to the Chinese. We should recognise that in Africa, for us, there are actually advantages for us. Africa has something to offer. China's seen that. China has been investing in Africa not because it's afraid of getting refugees, but in their own interest. I think very much of the debate in Europe has been revolving around migrants and less about the opportunities that cooperation in Africa can offer. Fourthly, our common foreign policy. The world is a less stable and safe place than it was. So at the same time, as we work hard internally, we need to strengthen our security externally. And we need to mesh closer together our common foreign defence policy. And it can actually save money. NATO has this famous 2% objective, which is discussed. But the truth is, in Europe, we spend about half of what the Americans, but we're only 50% as efficient as the Americans. And I would certainly propose that we need to pool more and work together. We could double our efficiency. Now, if we bear in mind what Günther Oettinger rightly proposed and have this 1.1 something objective, then relatively quickly you can show in a national debate what this actually means in practice. In Germany, for example, it would mean 1.2%, 10 billion euros extra. And it's a lot of money, yes, but at the same time, the American president would like Germany to increase its defense expenditure of 30 to 40 billion euros a year. So 10 billion into the Oettinger European objective, I think is going to help peace, certainly at least as much as pumping more money into NATO. And we need to look at how these things can work together. Can we strike the right balance if we consider what we still have to do elsewhere? Fifthly, innovation and research. Europe has to become more innovative. The gap between us and the US on technology, innovation in digital services is increasing. We need to have more effective energy-saving transport, improve many other areas too. We should not leave the efforts on this just to member states, but pool our efforts. So, in short, altogether, ladies and gentlemen, we need to redirect our European financing. It's only in that way that we can answer criticism we hear from all quarters and talk about the future of our continent. So on the shaping of our budget, I'll certainly make my contribution to ensure that Germany remains a constructive partner on the routes mapped out by Mr. Oettinger. And I think we can then make a difference to what we've seen in the past and what people have said about us in the past. We need to show courage and encourage others to follow the Commission on this way forward indicated by the Commission. So I appeal to the Commission that they submit an ambitious proposal for the next multi-financial framework. It represents a huge opportunity. And indeed, that opportunity comes only once every 7 years. And we should use this opportunity not just with tunnel vision, looking at net beneficiaries and net contributors, but being clear that Europe is our best and only opportunity to continue to shape in a sovereign way our own life in this modern world.